People are choosing free and cheap labor, right? People are choosing free markets. When you saw the standoff between the Western Cape government and taxis, that resulted in a few lives lost. The downside, I'll say, is that you're also now managing multiple interests, whereas before we just had to manage the ANC. You're seeing that in many of these negotiations, parties are really vying for power, and they can argue that it's because they want to make a difference. But I would rather see issues being the key driver of those negotiations rather than just positions.
Join us in supporting the Springboks when they take on the All Blacks at Ellis Park on the 31st of August 2024. We will be hosting exclusive hospitality at the Ellis Park Arena. Our hospitality includes pre-match analysis by international rugby players, lunch, drinks, Category A tickets inside the stadium so that you can enjoy the game right there. After the match, we're going to have live music, more food, more drinks, exclusive parking. What more could you want? If you want to join us and bring any size group, get more information below this video. And you're going to start on me, eh? Wait, put the camera on me. Whoa. Start on me. Okay, right. Count me in again.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the State of the Nation. Brought to you, as always, Pace Car Rental. Go and rent your car there and get a discount. And while you're on the internet doing that, subscribe and like this channel. We know that many of you watch without subscribing. If you subscribe, you'll get to know about every exciting episode that we bring to you of the State of the Nation as we grow, probably faster than other channels that deliver similar news, because we get the best guests. And it's always great to get somebody new and somebody who hasn't been on the State of the Nation before. And that's the case today. And joining me today is Makone Maja, campaign manager from the Institute of Race Relations. Makone, welcome to the State of the Nation. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a huge pleasure to join you here today.
You see, I really like it when people suck up to me. That's fantastic. Makone, tell us a bit about yourself. You're at the Institute of Race Relations. What exactly is the Institute of Race Relations out there to do? I know they've been around for a long time.
For going on over a century, the Institute is a think tank that houses some of the finest classical liberals in the country, thinkers. And our role really is to defend freedoms and liberties of South Africans against encroaching interests like government, like the private sector when they do. We go out there, we make a huge noise about it because we believe in freedom. Ultimately, that's the core belief of the Institute. We are also very gung-ho on economic growth, which has been very lacking in the country over the past couple of decades. And so that's been really our flagship message as of the past couple of years, is to pursue growth, but we believe that growth must be unrestricted and unlimited. And that's where we get to oppose some of those encroaching government policies.
Now, in one sentence, I think you managed to give a whole lot of people watching this heart failure already, because you mentioned a couple of things that aren't that highly regarded in South Africa. For starters, you mentioned liberalism, then you mentioned free markets, business, unlimited. These are all trigger words, but I want to dive into a few of them. Let's talk about liberalism as you understand it, because it's a word that's taken on a different dimension in the world over the last couple of years, isn't it? It's a word that's under siege and used very differently to the way it's intended.
True. I think liberalism has also had a few cousins like neoliberalism and a few breakaway versions of it. It's splintered as it's been around for hundreds of years now. But I think ultimately it speaks to limited government, right? It is the acknowledgement that the government does have a place in society, but that it should be small so that it allows it to function efficiently and effectively and with great agility to provide those very core fundamental services that a government out there should. Key among them, I would say, security, right? When you think of the emergence of liberalism, you think of how it came out of various thinkers ideating about the state of man, which is constantly under threat, right, from violence. Today, that violence takes place in various forms, including the government trying to seize property, right? And that's how you get rule of law and property rights being a fundamental tenet of liberalism. But ultimately, it speaks to the issue of a limited small government that is able to provide a small set of services to its citizens out there.
South Africa's got a perverted sense of what a government is meant to do, doesn't it? And obviously we've now sit with 80 almost unbroken years of nationalist governments that are very, very close to sort of, if not communist, at least socialist governments, and that is massive government that does just about everything. In actual fact, when people forget how close the National Party was to going to the other side of the aisle back in the day, and I would urge anybody that thinks that the National Party were always pro-business, they were far from it. In actual fact, they were quite in favour of big government and Pretoria shall provide. That was really the joke of the time, isn't it? But that kind of thinking in South Africa has got considerably worse since we've had, let's call it a neo-communist government in the ANC.
From Pretoria shall provide to the ANC shall provide. I've often listened to ANC spokespersons and members of the top seven speak very proudly about how the government takes care of its people from when they're children. It provides them with grants, and then it enables them to enroll to school for free, and then it carries them through and it pays for their tuition at university. And if you need health, they're there. Whatever you need, the government's there. So it's this sort of insidious, paternalistic nature of government that just keeps on stumbling on. And I think that liberalism gets a bad rep. But I actually think liberalism just describes man's true instincts for freedom. And I think liberalism doesn't get really good PR out there. But I think if it was to be presented to South Africans and the youth in the way that it will describe their lives, because I think ultimately people always choose to be free, right? When I think of recently the government's trying to crack down on companies like Shein and Temu, right? That's because people are choosing free and cheap labor, right? People are choosing free markets in a sense. Obviously, there's various challenges afflicting China, but people are constantly choosing freedom. And liberalism is advocating for that, for people to have the opportunity to be free and to elect freedom as their governing principle. So I do think that while South Africa has, as you've said, rolled from year on to decades now of that paternalistic, nationalist sort of big government, ultimately I do believe that people want to be free. And that's why I think there's a huge place for liberalism in the country.
Now, I can speak here as an old white guy about how difficult you would have explaining that to white people that have grown up in free market environment without some of the restrictions and strictures of apartheid and so on. But in the black community, there's a real issue, because there's a complete mistrust of free markets, a complete mistrust of the private sector. How do you see South Africa moving away from that?
I do think South Africa's introduction to the private sector, at least the Black South Africans' introduction, it was under oppressive circumstances. When you think of the Dutch East Indian Company that the likes of Jan van Riebeeck came here with, or even when you think of the mines and how they were formed and the oppression that they brought to Black neighborhoods. So I think that the initial introduction of companies to South Africa, of business and the private sector to South Africa, wasn't one that speaks to the issues that we're talking about, right? Freedom, a limited government, freedom of labor, let alone freedom of industry to really be competitive. But I think if you look at the townships, there's a lot of free markets there. There's a lot of free market capitalism where you can just set up a spaza shop and operate, right? You don't have as many government licensing requirements even to set up things like shebeens, which, there's a lot more freedom of business in the townships. And so that's where I would make the argument for Black people to look at when they want to see how the private sector is meant to operate. It's that we condemn how some of these companies that came to South Africa under apartheid and even colonial era came about, but that's not our point of reference for liberalism. The township would be actually our point of reference.
There's one. I mean, on the plus side, what you're talking about is something that I've spoken many times on this channel, and that is that I think there's a wonderful entrepreneurial spirit in South Africa, and I think it's alive, and I think people are quite accustomed to doing things for themselves, and I certainly see that kind of spirit alive and well in South Africans across the board. So I don't think that I certainly think that South Africa has all of the hallmarks of a country that would be a very successful free market country if it just got off the leash. However, if one looks at many of those township economies, and we've had people like Gigi Alcock on here talking about Casinomics, and to me the most important proof that there's something going on is the fact that, as I made the point and on a show on television, and JJ Tabani nearly choked, is that if the 350 Rand grant was so important, and that's what people were surviving on, they'd be dying in the streets, because you cannot survive on that kind of money. So clearly people are doing something else, and we know that there's an economy going out there. But now, even with that economy having been created, do we have a problem bringing them into the net? And by the net, I'm talking about tax paying, some regulatory compliance, etc.
Yeah, I think when you look at the taxi industry, it's clear that there's a problem there, a regulatory problem. Certainly one that relates to tax. But I also think when you saw the standoff between the Western Cape government and taxis that resulted in a few lives lost, you see that there's tension between the extent to which freedom should be allowed and permissible, and the role of the government to still clamp down or enforce rules, right, within the structure or the realm of freedom. But definitely there are regulatory problems, but there's also problems with just supporting informal businesses, right? Because typically they are lost to a mall coming in and setting up shop in that area. There's no way of upscaling those businesses, not just bringing them into the fold tax-wise, but also helping them create sustainable businesses that can last for generations. And I think that knowledge is lacking. That information is definitely not making its way to the townships, although things may be changing. I'm aware of a few projects that are taking place in various townships. But I do think that formalization of informal businesses does not just relate to the issue of taxes, but also of supporting them so that once they are formalized, they're able to run for generations and sustainably, and even coordinate and compete against some of those like gentrification, when you have a mall coming into a township, which ultimately leads to the closure of tens of spaza shops, likely does.
Well, I've got to say, I sort of get a bit of a smile on my face, because when I think back, I can remember clearly the outcry against those very same companies when they weren't building malls in the townships. Mm. And I remember at that stage, President Nelson Mandela being quite strident that, using their favorite A word, the fact that malls weren't being built in the townships. So, sometimes you've got to say, which is it? Because if the people that build malls or the big shopping chains didn't have those malls, everybody would say, you're continuing apartheid. So, I think that we need a better mousetrap here. But to blame the mall is, there was an outcry when there wasn't a mall. So I'm saying that in this case, I very rarely have sympathy with big companies. This is one of the times that I do, because there was an outcry when there wasn't a mall in those areas. So I can see how this has come to pass.
I can also empathize with that. I think malls are great enterprises. I mean, they are a one-stop shop, right? And they provide tens of thousands of jobs in the country. But I think for the president, Nelson Mandela at the time, that was a huge opportunity missed to actually upscale and upskill townships so that they can create their own sort of not to the extent of a mall, but maybe a plaza, you know. So I think there were opportunities missed there to transition informal businesses and create them so that they can run on their own and compete against malls. But I don't condemn malls at large. I'm just saying more competition, more freedom would have really changed the face of townships and the face of informal business in the country.
But I think that the point you made is well made. I don't think it's restricted to townships. In actual fact, I think it cuts across South Africa because it's become very difficult in the face of these mega companies that, you know, where you can go into a supermarket and buy everything you ever needed. What product are you and I going to sell when we decide to start a business? Right, and the space has been absolutely closed for small businesses in South Africa. On top of it, we've got a government that is obsessed with red tape. Now, I'd imagine, you know, I've constantly made this reference, and eventually I found out that the man does exist, but there's a person that Cyril Ramaphosa appointed by the name of Sipho Nkosi, whose job it was to cut red tape, and apparently wasn't very good at it. But this must be something that you have to take up quite a lot, is the fight against state red tape when it comes to business.
Yeah, that's true, Mike. We fight against various measures of red tape, be they race-based laws in this country that are a form of bureaucracy, or localization requirements. So the Institute definitely does attack red tape from various angles. Even when you think about initiatives like the NHI, that's another form of red tape. It's just extending the list of requirements to enter business, right? And so there are many ways in which we try to attack and eat at that behemoth. But I do think the point you made earlier cuts across industries. When you think of not beyond red tape, but when you think of how many South African big businesses are given sort of a couch, a cushion by the government when they do business with them and they get to make money from the business, and how much harder it is for small businesses to do business with the government for various reasons, because the government doesn't pay well or because the long list of requirements there are to do business with the government. But that for big businesses, that's not a problem, right? So if you and I start let's say an insurance company, since you have Pace Car Rental on there, it'll be so much difficult for us to compete with bigger insurance companies who get that cushion from the government and also have these departments that cross different departments within the insurance industry alone. You know, they can manage to offer diverse products. For you and I, it'll just be that one product and then fighting against the fact that they already have this cushion that comes in the form of government protection, government subsidies, doing business with government. So there's just red tape that cuts across industries in so many ways and ultimately stifles and stymies the ability for small business to really flourish in the country.
Let's start with your struggles, which you have. Your organisation has got a lot of column inches about in the news, and that has been your fight against BEE. Now, what is your problem with BEE?
Sure.
Is South Africa not, given our history, is it not necessary in South Africa?
I have written a little bit about BEE, and my problem with BEE is that it essentially systematizes patronage and the patrimonial system, which is not unique to South Africa. When you actually think about Western countries, which today run based on merit, when you think about the UK and the US, particularly the US, it struggled with patronage as well, right? Upon its founding, you had the US was rife with things like clientelism, and it was also, it had a serious problem of cadre deployment, right? Although its cadre deployment issues were rather different because the cadres were all members of the elites and the aristocracy, all emerging from your Ivy League universities, which meant that the little guy who didn't have the opportunity to go to the fancy schools still couldn't make it into government civil service. Today, South Africa's BEE looks like government jobs being given to friends and family of the state. And that's the key problem with BEE, is that because you have jobs that could honestly transform people's lives, when you think about how a lot of infrastructure in the country is tethered to BEE, right? You cannot give a government contract that solves an infrastructure problem without it going through BEE or having BEE requirements intrinsic to it. And what you do in that sense is you give that job to somebody who is closely related to the government, and that person doesn't do the job well. And then I ask, how does that benefit Black people? I'll give you a specific case that really riled me up recently, where I saw there was an issue with a bridge that was built in my home province of Limpopo. And I've never seen a homemade bridge, but it was very obvious to me, Mike, that that one was pretty homemade, okay? And yet the government had paid 5 million rands for that bridge. But it was clear to any eye, even myself who's outside of the construction industry and has no experience in construction, could tell that very few skills and very few of that 5 million rand went towards paying that bridge, right? And that is a bridge that's meant to lift that community out of poverty. You know, it means that children get to go to school when there's flooding due to the rain. It means that ambulances rather, get to enter those communities when there's emergencies, right? But all of that is taken away when you have this poorly built bridge that will ultimately collapse. And yet the state has spent so much money dedicated to that bridge. But key to that amount is that not only do various people need to be paid, but the BEE requirements make it such that race is an important measure of whether or not you get the contract, right? And race has nothing to do with things like bridges being built, at least bridges being built competently. So why make it a requirement for doing business or for obtaining a government contract? I think we should look at value for money procurement rather than making race a prerequisite for whether or not you get government contracts. So my problem with BEE is multifold, but ultimately it's that it incentivizes patronage, which is the stuffing of government offices with friends and families of politicians and members of the political elites, but also that it robs people. I call BEE I call it the Robin Hood from Shein, because it's supposed to redistribute income, but what it does, it actually just makes rich people richer, because it's the same people getting the contracts all the time because they're so closely related or familiar with members of the government. So in that way, it's not actually Robin Hood. It robs the people for whom it's intended to uplift, for whom it's meant to end marginalization on behalf of. And so I think that Black people have been robbed for a long time by BEE. And I think I'm actually confident that once they realize this, that once this message goes down to the little man, that there will be a revolution against BEE that is grassroots, and it starts from the bottom rather than from the top down.
But how do you answer the point that's made that if it wasn't for BEE, it would be even more difficult for any Black business person to break into the formal economy?
I find that a bit condescending, those arguments, because Black businesses were thriving even under apartheid when the system was very hostile, right, to Black enterprising. And so I definitely don't think that that's true. You have a Black government that should be keen. I mean, we have top to down Black government, well, until the GNU, that's a bit different. But still, there's very little discrimination in government, and government is the one that issues the contracts. So how can you possibly make the case that the government would act against a Black person? I think Black businesses are competent to run and compete against white businesses in a way that I think BEE is actually destructive, because it makes white businesses more competitive because they have to work harder to get a government contract, right? Whereas Black people are eligible in part because they're Black, which has nothing to do ultimately with the services that are being required and delivered and exchanged.
So you mentioned in there the GNU, the Government of National Unity. South Africa is at a new phase of our development. I've called it the end of not the beginning of the end of South Africa, but the end of the beginning of the new South Africa, because it is a new time. South Africa, obviously, since 1994, has been ruled quite comfortably, governed quite comfortably by a very, very comfortable majority of the ANC. Now they have to deal with a whole lot of parties in a government of national unity. From where you sit, do you see this having a positive effect on the country?
I do. I think breaking away the ANC's hegemony allows for political competition, which we're already reaping the benefits of, right? When you hear comments being made, at least that was the news last week, that the ANC were threatened by the appearance of competence on the part of DA and the PA Minister, Gayton McKenzie, in that they do and give media interviews and are able to defend their positions and show that they've actually done the groundwork required to identify problems that they will solve during their time. But you're already seeing those junctions inspire competition and inspire the ANC to get up and actually start servicing and working on behalf of the country rather than just serving its own interest. And so I think in many ways, the GNU, that sort of political competition is good. The downside, I'll say, is that you're also now managing multiple interests, whereas before we just had to manage the ANC. You're seeing that in many of these negotiations, parties are really vying for power, and they can argue that it's because they want to make a difference. But I would rather see issues being the key driver of those negotiations rather than just positions, which is what it appears to me from as an audience as an audience and a fellow South African. It seems that above all interests, they've placed their own rather than, for example, in the GPU negotiations in Gauteng, the residents' issues that they're facing there, the city of Johannesburg residents' issues that they're facing there. You're not hearing a lot of contention about the issues necessarily, but it's still so heavily about positions being traded before you even hear issues being raised. So I think there are upsides, but I also acknowledge and take into stock the downsides.
I suppose one of the big, you mentioned competition as well. One of the things that has come home is that I thought that the outcome of the elections was the fact that people, South African voters, were saying, don't abuse us. There will be repercussions for somebody who does a poor job. So, if at very least it does nothing else, it might have shown our politicians that if they must do a better job or else there will be, a judgment day, and it'll come on polling day, because we're definitely seeing that.
A line has been drawn in the sand. And I think those people who've been so in despair and I'll say black-pilled about the nature of democracy, I think this will invigorate confidence that democracy does work if you show up to the polls and you make different choices, right? We've got fresh blood in the government across all parties, actually, including the ANC. You're seeing and hearing about ministers whose names I do not recognize, have not been so deep in the system, although those ones are still there. But I think definitely that South Africans have drawn a line in the sand to say enough with the abuse. We want services and we want them delivered now.
Yeah, and I think we've also taken the average age down by about 10 years, which can't be a bad thing in a country like South Africa. Certainly the one thing that we're seeing the responsiveness from certain of the new ministers being something we are just absolutely not accustomed to. An issue comes out and you have somebody commenting, even if we don't like the comment, at least they're not acting like the thing didn't happen in the first place.
Exactly. There's actually accountability.
There's a bit of accountability, but it's only spreading over a handful of ministries at this point. Pretty soon it's going to start looking glaringly obvious who's not responding.
Well, it's still early days. Let's give them the benefit of time and say it hasn't, I don't even think it's been 4 months of them in government.
Yeah, I know.
So I think perhaps as time goes on, we'll start to see the ministers who are very outspoken also influence the ones who are still shielded
Yeah.
behind the scenes. But I also think one of the responses that I don't know what you've observed, Mike, but is the outpouring support for ministers that have been outspoken. And how I've been measuring that is through YouTube comments. That's the least I could do. But when I see your ministers, whether it's McPherson, he's been out there, or Leon Schreiber as well. Dr. Schreiber has also been out there. When I see them on news channels online, and I look through the comments, there's just so much support for just what you said, that we've just gotten so accustomed to not being accounted to, that just having a minister go and speak about what problems they're facing in their department that they haven't even created, right? It's not like they're liable, at least not now. They will be eventually. But just people have been very receptive of their presence and their willingness to be confronted by journalists.
Yeah. Obviously, what we also seeing, we'll touch on it a bit later, is a massive difference in cultures. There's an issue there, and while we bring up the issue of culture, you are sitting in a cross-cultural situation right now. It has been, classic liberalism has been the haven of pipe-smoking white men, right? You don't look like you smoke a pipe, and the rest you fail dismally. You definitely.
I don't look like a.
Yeah. But what is it like for and what are the difficulties that a person like yourself faces in being in an organization with roots so deeply entwined with white South Africa? You must have got an enormous amount of feedback on this, on doing this kind of work.
Well, say from being inside the institute and having a background in academia, I have never felt freer to think. And even within the institute, there's diversity of thought, not people's favorite kind of diversity, but there's still a lot of disagreements about how liberalism should take form. So that sort of freedom has been very, 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 very a great sense of liberty and security as well, to say that there's no wrong think, but that you will be confronted if your ideas don't match up or stand the sniff test. I think people struggle with seeing people like me espouse liberal beliefs. And so they attach liberalism to a specific race or a specific class. But again, I think I've just illustrated earlier on, just speaking with you, that liberalism is not owned by any specific demographic or socioeconomic class. It exists in townships, right? So I don't see the conflict between my race, certainly, and my ethos and my guiding principles being of limited government and freer people. If anything, I think the history of this country advocates for freer people and liberalism. So I would have any problem with somebody who would want to argue with me specifically on that issue.
Yeah, because I do feel for you in this position, because you are going to have to answer some questions. I mean, I get it quite a lot, because I think that it starts often with language. I mean, I was amazed to see that when after the Government of National Unity was formed, that the EFF and the Mkhonto Wesizwe said that they were going to start the Progressive Parties movement. And I'm thinking that those parties, as I see it, are anything but progressive. In fact, they're regressive. They going back to ideologies, from 100 years ago, of we're in charge, we'll tell you what to do, and we'll tell you where to live. I see that as being the opposite of progress, much like people saying that they are fighting for economic freedom or fighting for the turning off of economic freedom, as I see it. So, because economic freedom is the freedom to act freely.
Exactly.
And, and grow and build and accumulate wealth. That's economic freedom, isn't it?
Absolutely. Economic freedom does not look like being told what to do, but also people
Or
thinking
how to dress.
or how to dress, but also people thinking on your behalf. I think so much of economic freedom people think of in the sense of movement of human capital, right? But also of thought. When you think about the apartheid government and how much it clamped down on speech that it didn't like, that to me does not look like like freedom. And I think economic freedom needs to be advocated for through speech, so and through thought, right? Freedom to think, freedom of expression. And so there's just so many components to this that I think, and when I say that working for the Institute has allowed me to think freely, as a key principle of liberalism, is pro people like me, right? That we are able to think for ourselves.
Now, let's talk about people like you. That always sounds nice when it comes out of an old white guy. But an election has just been held. And, we've seen, for example, many black people. Just, you don't have to be a statistician or a poll taker or anything. We know that, for example, the Democratic Alliance got more black votes than the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP. That's, people aren't making enough, taking enough notice of that. But the question that I put to you is, obviously, I know that the figures are in the millions of black people that voted for what used to be called white parties. And depending on who you're speaking to, they'll still call them white parties. But why do they do it so silently, in your opinion?
I think.
And when will that change?
I will say about the IFP, which I've never considered, is that I think its roots suggested, at least previously, that it was for Zulu people. And so that could be one reason why it's not widely supported. You have seven
I'm
other
just using
cultures.
that as a way of illustrating that a lot of black people voted. In this case, we're not talking shilling for the DA, but what I'm saying is a lot of black people did vote for the DA.
Yeah.
But yet they did it quite quietly, and they're not making a big noise about it.
I'll put this on the table. I'll say that people widely want the same things, and that's to have water and electricity through your pipes without being accused of, like you said, shilling for any white party. And I think the noise usually comes from the internet. And at least on the internet, you will be punished if you don't toe a certain orthodoxy that they've set out for you to believe and to vote and to align with. And so I think that's why the silence and the lack of pride in people's voting decisions, it's that they're aware that they will be punished for not towing the line of very specific tenets that you have to espouse because you're black or because you're colored or Indian. But I think people ultimately still want to have electricity and claim their race and their culture with pride and not have that taken away from them by some internet character. But I do think a lot of the noise happens online. I'm not sure that's conversations on the ground in person away from the very divisive Twitter, that people are as silent when it's not online, when dialogues are being held in person.
I want to close off by talking about generational wealth. Where does the IRR stand on generational wealth, which is usually associated with issues of wealth accumulation, property rights, etc. And, once again, is this a trend you see growing in South Africa or not?
The Institute is pro people being able to accumulate wealth, right? But for that to happen, from our vantage point as liberals, it's that it can only happen if the economy is liberated and freed. We want to see economic growth. We want investment to perpetuate a cycle of job creation so that we can end economic exclusion and economic marginalization. When you think of a country where nearly half of the population lives just by the upper poverty line, I mean, that's devastating. And that tells you that there's actually not many opportunities for your regular South African to accumulate wealth. And that's why we defend people's ability to do just that against a government that wants to clamp down on freedoms that will enable people to accumulate wealth. And so we're pro-wealth for anyone who desires it, however they want to accumulate it. But again, it can only happen if the economy is unrestricted. We spoke earlier about freedom of movement of capital and of labor. Those are some of the ideas, but we should also speak about property rights, right? That you cannot have wealth generation without property rights. Nobody wants to generate wealth that will ultimately be expropriated and taken by a government entity for whatever reason, right? But again, you have to have those foundations set in place to enable a generation of people to be able to amass wealth. Wealth in this country should not be for only a certain group of people, whether it's the politically connected or, as people like to claim, just white people, right? But if we have policy that actually stops people from being able to accumulate wealth, which we currently do when you have bills like the expropriation bill sitting before the president, then we have a serious problem of actually not allowing people who have been excluded for generations to enter the fold and be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, essentially, and start to bring wealth into their families.
Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that was very, very well put together and very well explained. I'd like to thank Makone for joining us, Makone Maja. She's with the Institute of Race Relations. It's been fantastic. If you've enjoyed this, you're definitely going to hear more from us. You're definitely going to hear more from Makone. And you know the state of the nation. We're going to say, before we leave you, so like and subscribe. Makone, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. It's been great. To everybody out there, support Pace Car Rental and support the State of the Nation. Thank you.